Welcome to the Blended Finance Project interview series, where we talk to international development and solidarity scholars, labor and civil society activists about the recent turn to so-called innovative finance for development in Canada. I'm your host, Susan Spronk, Associate Professor at the School of International Development and Global Studies at the University of Ottawa. Welcome back, everybody. So I'm pleased to be here today with Masaya Llavaneras Blanco and Corina Enriquez. So I'll introduce Masaya first. So Masaya is a feminist political economist. She's an incoming assistant professor of development studies at Huron University College at Western University in London, Ontario. She holds a PhD in global governance from Wilfrid Laurier University, and she is also an executive committee member of Development Alternatives with Women for a New Era, otherwise known as DAWN. Masaya works on issues of social policy, human mobility, and migration in the Global South. And we're also here with Corina, and Corina is a feminist economist. She is a researcher for the National Council of Research, which is known as CONICET, at the Interdisciplinary Center for the Study of Public Policy in Buenos Aires, Argentina. She is also the co-director of a PhD program on political economy at the Interdisciplinary School of Social Studies and a professor at national universities in Argentina. She is also an executive committee member at Development Alternatives with Women for a New Era, DAWN. Corina works on issues related to social and fiscal policies, corporate capture, inequality, and care economy. And one of the reasons we're here today is that Masaya and Corina were both part of a recently published report, which is published in March of this year, called Ppps and Women's Human Rights, Feminist Analysis from the Global South. So one of the things we're hoping to talk about today is feminist analysis of private forms of development financing, including blended finance. So welcome, Masaya and Corina. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you. We're glad to be here.
Thank you.
Great. So my first question is about blended finance. So the Blended Finance Project seeks to critique some of the broader impacts of shifts towards attracting private sector development investments. How do PPPs or public-private partnerships fit into these broader processes and shifts in global development governance?
We at DAWN locate the PPP's tendency and process within a broader one where blended finance fit that we call a process of corporate capture of the states, but also of the global governance. And this happens because of a kind of a perverse mechanism by which there has been for many years a race to the bottom in fiscal and tax standards. Corporations are willing to pay less taxes every day. They do tax dodging all the time. There is this flow of illicit financial flows. So the states, because they receive less income every time they go through this fiscal crisis, and then they are forced to implement austerity policies. And because they are forced to implement austerity policies, fail to be able to keep infrastructure as needed by the development process. And then here it comes the private sector again. First they come by not wanting to pay taxes, and then they come by having the money that the states need to provide for infrastructure and for social provisioning. And this process is what we call the corporate capture, because the states are in a way captured by the private interests. And the private interest in a way, also because of the narrative that support this process, the private interests become as a public one. This narrative is such that makes the private interest appear to be the public one, that whatever is good for corporations is good for citizens and for all of us. And this is PPPs is the new shape of this process. It's not exactly new because PPPs, public partnerships, have been there for long, but they are now renewed as a long-standing process of privatization. And I think PPPs now have a renewed push because, one, they open new business opportunities for the private sector, specifically in those sectors where public provisioning was the rule. Now the private sector is entering in this sector, and this opens new business opportunity for corporation. Second, because it's a way of sharing risk between the private sector and the public sector. So there is a shift of risk between corporations to the public sector. And the last point I would highlight is that also this push is explained by the whole process of financialization, because there is a financial aspect on PPPs that also feed this stage of financial capitalism.
Fantastic. Thanks, Corina, for giving us that overview about corporate capture. So what do you think the impact is of PPPs in the Global South?
I would say there is a kind of a broad impact, which is a shift on development priorities. Because of the need of the private sector financing, private sector has the ability to decide which are the relevant investments. So investment is not oriented to people's needs, but mainly to private sector willingness to gain more profit. So this means a shift on priorities, because there might be projects that they might be not so profitable, but very much needed in terms of what people need, but still government, because of this pressure of the private sector, decide to invest in a different type of sector. So the first thing I would say is that there is a shift on priorities, on the priority setting, and this also shows a limitation, a reduction in policy space, in public policy space. And then there are more a concrete impact on people who live in the Global South in terms of, and we can elaborate later a bit more about this. One impact that the empirical studies show is that PPPs at the end imply higher costs than direct public investment. So in a way, there is an impact on the costs. And because these are PPPs and the private sector is run by profit, then they need to have this profit. And many times, in order to guarantee this profit, access to the services are limited to people who cannot pay for it. So there is also limited access to services as a consequence of the PPPs projects. And also, depending on the project, in the big infrastructure project, in PPPs on energy, for example, there is also processes of displacement of population, which are very significant in terms of the impact on people's livelihoods. And the last thing I would point to is that the PPPs, I think they feed a process of poor transparency and accountability, which is something that we already deal with in the Global South, with our governments not being enough accountable. And I think this PPP project really fit to that, because the negotiations are very obscure. The contracts many times are secret, and citizens cannot access to the information and cannot monitor the process and the delivery.
Great, thanks. So one of the things that we talk a lot about when talking about PPPs is risk. And so what do you think are some of the risks of orienting development investment towards bankable or profitable projects, or projects that make money, as you pointed out, which of course is a requirement for attracting private investment?
I think the idea of rendering development into a business niche of sorts creates a very wrong set of incentives in terms of policy. It creates bad policy and misplaces the focus that is, well-being and development, and shifts the attention to profit making in cases that are not always compatible, and in fact are mostly problematic, right? So this idea that development has to produce a profit limits the capacity for the provision of effective services and fair services. And this is very clear in public services, in terms of water, infrastructure, energy. And it's also very clear in terms of health and education. Health and education are not sectors that are meant to produce profit or gains in a dollar value in immediate ways, but we know they produce societal gains that are necessary in the long term. But if our set of incentives for creating policy is focused on the immediacy of a dollar value for a particular corporation, we're going to produce poor societal results. And we are sacrificing the rights of human rights, the rights of people, in the name of the allure of a certain efficiency and a certain expediency that also, when we analyze on the ground, are not really what we're seeing. So we're not even getting the promise of these effective, expedite service delivery. We're seeing serious delays, opaque practices, and the erosion of human rights. So it's a bad deal altogether.
So how do you think PPPs impact the beneficiaries of development programs, but particularly girls and women, which is the focus of your recent report?
In the case of beneficiaries, which is a complicated term in and of itself, the first gendered effect that comes to mind relates again to the way care labor is gendered and is racialized, and how it's assigned heavily on women, makes women perhaps the most affected sectors when there are privatization processes in terms of health provision, in terms of water provision. If there is any weakness or any limitation in their access to these infrastructure services and other forms of services, not only they are having less access in individual terms, but they're also increasing their labor loads because they are the default buffer. When the systems are failing, it is women whose unpaid labor increase, and thus not only they are having limitations in their own sets of rights, but they are also covering for the lack of access that the rest of the communities may have, right? So if we, and this is a common occurrence in PPP and other privatization processes, if we're including or imposing out-of-pocket costs, we are not only excluding people that live in poverty, but also increasing the labor loads of women. And this is a vicious circle. A lot of development projects, and this is particularly important in Canadian foreign policy, this idea of economic empowerment of women is part of the development agenda and the foreign affairs kind of motto in the current government in Canada. If we want to facilitate the incorporation of women in the labor market in fair terms, but at the same time, we're privatizing the public services that will facilitate everyday life, we are actually working in contradictory ways. If we want women to be able to participate in the labor market, we need to guarantee the services and the infrastructure that would enable them to actually reduce their unpaid labor load and then increase their paid labor load, because otherwise they just don't have the time or even the incentives to participate in an economic system that is actually pushing them out.
Can I add something to that one? I think this is an important question because many times we think that PPPs are something abstract that has nothing to do with our everyday life. And when we go and see empirically how PPPs work, we realize there are very concrete impact in everyday life, as the one that Masaya was pointing out too. In the cases we developed, the case studies we developed at Dawn, it was clear, for example, in Ghana, the case looked at developing of infrastructure for a street market where women were mainly who were there selling their products. And it's very clear how the infrastructure they created was not necessarily what women need, but also it made more costly for women to be able to occupy the space in the street market. So in fact, something that we can think, oh, it's good for these women to have a infrastructure there, a little roof, but then women was more difficult for women to access that space. And this is very concrete for the everyday economic survival activities of women in this example. We have many cases on the health sector, and there it is very clear how PPPs mean less access of women, and especially of poor women, to health services. And we also have a case in Sierra Leone where it is very clear, it's a case linked to energy, and it's very clear how they displace people, and they provided them with a kind of replacement of what used to be the source of their livelihood, that of course didn't meet what they need. So there are very concrete impact in people access to health services, people access to the possibility of carrying their economic activities, and on the possibility even on having food security because of this displacement from what has historically been the way they survive. And I would like to add two more. One is the impact on women's labor rights and conditions, because in many sectors, women are majority among workers of the PPP's project, and labor conditions there are getting more precarious. And the second one is the impact on women's human rights defenders and women's defenders of the the earth, I would say, because when people organize and resist this project, women are leaders of those resistances and are criminalized and are persecuted by the companies. So the impact on women's human rights defenders is also relevant.
Another aspect, and we could go on for a long time with this question. Another aspect that I think is a good example for people to learn about is the concrete health outcomes of some of the PPPs on health. And it's perhaps one of the clearest pieces of evidence about the poor policy outcomes that are produced through these strategies, and also how they erode human rights. What we found that in the case of India, for example, where there is one of the largest in the public-private partnerships in the global south, in the form of an insurance scheme for people who live in poverty. And through this, the implementation of the insurance scheme, what was found is that the number of C-sections and the number of unnecessary C-sections and unnecessary hysterectomies increased. It went through the roof, the number of these interventions, especially among women who are of lower income groups, among women who are of racialized castes. So we found that they were not offered alternative treatments for things that had alternative treatments in any other circumstance. And of course, it became again an issue of profit over rights. And this is why I was speaking about the wrong set of incentives altogether, because the policy is no longer about health provision and health outcomes, but actually private gain. And this is, I mean, I'm talking about the Indian case, but if you think about the Zimbabwean case and the privatization of a hospital, one of the most important hospitals of the country, actually, how this created an issue of staff, because staff was more available and willing and interested in providing services for those who could pay out-of-pocket services, and those that could not pay, who are the 90% of women in a maternal health hospital, would bear the brunt of the lack of services, and this eventually costs human lives.
Certainly, we've seen in some countries like Spain, with the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic, they actually decided to return a hospital to public hands for exactly the reasons that the private hospital, which had a profit motive, started laying off staff in the context of a health crisis. So yes, thank you. And I noticed that we'll put a link in the notes to the report that you've just released. There's a number of different case studies that you've mentioned here on the question of health, which certainly important always, but particularly in the context of this pandemic. So Corina, you've already mentioned a bit about the problems of governance with PPPs, noting that there's a problem with transparency and accountability with these arrangements. I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit more about some of the risks that are inherent in these arrangements.
Yes, I think the risk is basically the risk of citizenship being unable to monitor what's going on. And it starts from the very beginning, because negotiations are carried out at closed doors, and contracts are not made available. In Argentina, for example, which is not one case that we have developed within DON, but I live in Argentina, and here, even when civil society asks for the information from the contract, it is denied. Even when we have the right to access information, it is denied. So this also has implications because the contracts are changed along the way. So whatever has been signed at the first time, it can be changed, and it's always changed in favor of the private sector. And there is no way that citizenship can monitor this and can claim, and you know that information is also power. So if people don't have information about what's going on, then people cannot claim. And I would also insist on this idea that this lack of transparency and lack of accountability feed a way of doing public policy, which is quite limited in this sense in many countries in the global south, but I think also in the north.
Masaya, do you have something to add there? Or?
Well, I was thinking of cases, some of the cases that we have researched about, and we've done this, and it's important to mention, with advocates and researchers throughout the global south. So we are sharing with you information that has been collected collectively, and we commend the labor of many researchers who are cited in our report, who are the main source of all this we're sharing with you. One of the cases or two of the cases that come to mind in terms of lack of transparency are the case of Fiji, where they commissioned one of the first Ppps, one of the first public-private partnership processes in the country, with the renovation of a hospital and the construction of a new one. And nobody was consulted. It is unclear what the hospitals will be dealing with, what kind of specialties, who will be the beneficiaries of these hospitals. And this is a source of concern for many reasons, in terms of service delivery, for sure, in terms of the potential privatization of services that are public at the moment, and also with the potential creation of health tourism as a new source of macroeconomic income for a country that is already heavily dependent on tourism. So this idea of development as a business niche is creating the conditions to perpetuate processes of dependency that are already vicious and are likely to be deepened through a process like this. Another case where lack of transparency is also clear is in the case of Peru, in one large hospital, where again, even though the contracts were available, all the information back in the contracts, all the reports that sustained the decisions to go forward with the contracts are not available to the population. And this is not only the general public who are not aware of these issues, but nurses, medical doctors, as people who have this specialty to actually look at this information and have informed judgment. They are not consulted, and they are not even having access to this. So the opacity is widespread, which is often in contrast to what they say the public-private partnerships would be. They're often, portrayed as a form of increased transparency, but we have seen the opposite in all 10 cases that we researched.
Great. So one of the things we're also talking about in the series are the alternatives to this form of development financing. And one of the alternatives I think you've already mentioned is public provision directly itself, because it's cheaper and less complicated. And in particular, Corina, you were noting that PPPs inevitably lead to cost overruns. So that's certainly one thing. But I'm wondering if you can tell us a little bit about the civil society movements that have been resisting this agenda, particularly those led by women. And again, Corina, you mentioned earlier that especially earth defenders, a lot of these movements and anti-privatization movements are led by women. So what are women and girls and other folks doing to contest this agenda and its harmful impacts? So tell us a little bit more about the resistance that you've seen.
It's a big question, so I'm trying, as much as I've thought about this already, I'm still thinking about how to tackle it. The first approach that I think has been taken by different groups, and this reminds me of the case of Ghana with the privatization of popular market spaces, our communal market spaces, is the idea of bringing the state back in. In a way, we idealize the state as a always fair and transparent actor. We know there are many problems with it, but the state, at least in principle, has the duty to protect human rights of its citizens, and hopefully also the inhabitants of the territories that it governs. So the state is an interlocutor for movements to engage with in relatively fair terms, or less unfair terms, as it is when citizens and people in general are trying to tackle corporations who have in principle no need to enter into conversation with the general public. Corporations are accountable to themselves, and the state should be accountable to people. So bringing the state back in is the main way to go. And this has many forms and shapes. In the case of Ghana, for example, street sellers, well, they protested in front of the market, in front of their MPs, and they also, played electoral politics and brought this conversation into the electoral process in a way that favored them, and in fact made the state come back. Is one of the cases in which we found civil society effectively bringing up positive results, or at least results that create some form of optimism. I think another aspect here is the importance of broad coalitions. Unions are an important aspect of civil society mobilization around this. And in the case of health, for example, nurses are at the forefront of asking for contracts, of asking for consultations. And this is not, a coincidence. It is often nurses, which are amongst the lowest paid of health workers, who are bearing the brunt of these privatization processes. They're often paid publicly to subsidize with their labor private services. So these broad coalitions are a very important strategy, and I think it's a strategy that we see at play. It's not a recommendation of ours, it's something that is already happening. And also, I think, as Dawn, what we're trying to do with our research is to see how these processes that seem to be very local and very specific to every national context, and to place them into a global context and demonstrate how they are part of a global process in which the development discussion is being privatized. And this is hard to see when you're on the ground and you're, facing the privatization of the One Health service that you access. You're too busy with survival often to be able to see the larger picture. So with our research, we have the opportunity to say, hey, this that is happening in this particular hospital in an island of Fiji is very similar to what is happening in Peru or to what is happening in Zimbabwe. And there are all these common patterns that we can see and put together and that link up to global governance processes quite clearly. So it's not only about producing evidence, which is also a main aspect of our work, but it's also to put it together and show how these are not isolated cases, but it's a systemic problem that needs to be tackled systemically. And one more thing, sorry, that I wanted to mention was that when thinking about these strategies and how they work well, in the cases in which they work well because the states have already built in capacity. These are strong states that already have a long history of, service provision. So they bring these examples and they want to match them in cases where states are weaker institutionally and PPPs farther weaken them. So it's almost counterintuitive. If you want, maybe what you want is to invest in state capacity to provide these services. And also, and this reminded me, your comment reminded me about this. One of the risks of pushing so hard with this agenda is that we're not attending to other aspects of the picture that need to be addressed. And maybe it's not a coincidence. We could be speaking about fiscal reforms. We could be speaking about tax changes globally and nationally, different forms of revenue collecting rather than bringing the private actors. So it's almost a distraction as well.
Corina, did you want to add something?
Just one coin here, referring to who do we think needs to be accountable for this, because resistances many times are also located where the PPPs happen, and then they claim for the local state, they claim for the national state. But linking to what Masaya was saying, there is also a trend of global resistance to this that involve organizations in the global south and in the global north. And we need to make international financial institutions accountable. The World Bank, for example, is a big time promoter of PPPs, but we also need to make governments in the global north accountable, because they are also the one pushing for the corporations of their countries profiting for this process. So I fully agree that the global resistance is also very much needed here.
Great. So one of the things I think civil society organizations in Canada have been very good at is looking at questions of tax justice and corporate accountability, and particularly in the mining sector is, I think, one where there's been a lot of public attention and energy. And one of the purposes of this this series is really to look at questions of development financing too, which are linked to these agendas of privatization. And one of the governments of the North, which is a latecomer to this game, but heavily pushing blending, is the Canadian government. So thank you for helping us get a global feminist perspective on this issue. And thank you very much for sharing your thoughts. And I would recommend to all listeners to look up the reports, again, called PPPs, Women's Human Rights, Feminist Analysis from the Global South. So thank you so much, Masaya and Corina, for joining us.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.